because you did comfort, power, and control.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of, I think they all work together.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think like once you start mentioning comfort, for me, that also comes into control, which also means you don't have any power.
Right.
So
they're all attached.
yeah. So it's, I think, but for me, the one comfort, because there are times, like even with being here at First Church or even being at First Baptist, you and Josh have just this thing of putting me in positions that make me uncomfortable. So then there's sometimes
You're welcome.
So then sometimes I'm like, Lord, why? But then even knowing, I think something I struggled with was, I talked to Ben about this like a few months ago, and I was just like, like I found out I'm going to have to be here a whole year longer. And one of my best friends, Nash, he's leaving. So one of my best friends is gone. Jonathan may even be gone before me because of me having to be here for a whole nother year. So it's just like, I'm going to be here without any friends almost, and in Grayson longer than what I wanted to be. I was kind of upset at the Lord at first because I was like, why are you keeping me here longer than I have to be? And then Ben told me, he was like, you don't have any control over this. And I was like, okay. So
Yeah, I'd even said in my message yesterday that, when I was first pastoring, people, I'd ask somebody to do something, or I would challenge them with something, and they would come back to me and they go, I'm just not comfortable. That makes me uncomfortable. And I would be like, oh, okay, I understand. I get it. And my it's kind of changed a little bit. And it's not cold and heartless, I don't think. But mainly my primary response right now when they say I'm not comfortable with that is like, I don't care. It's really not about you, so I don't care.
It's like, that's a good thing. That means even more reason to do it.
Exactly.
We're doing that with our Wednesday night group. We're sort of doing this coming Wednesday, we're doing a preaching practice type thing where each kid is to give a 5-minute devotional on their favorite Bible verse. And a lot of them, or quite a few of them, seem very uncomfortable. But I think oftentimes those are the ones who actually do the best.
Yeah.
We've seen that with people who get up to the front to do a reading or a thought or something. Usually the ones who are super nervous about it put in the most work and end up doing a fantastic job.
Exactly. That's very true.
Yeah, the amount of work Catherine put in to do that.
She did such a good job.
She did.
Did such a good job.
Yeah, I'll make sure she watches this.
Yeah.
Because she literally thought she did terrible. I'm like, you did great.
No, it was better than anything I've done up there when it comes to readings. I can't do readings.
I'm not for sure how I'm supposed to respond to that.
Huh?
When he makes that statement, I'm not for sure how I'm supposed to respond to that, because I want to acknowledge how well she did, but then at the same time, I'll be like, "You're exactly right. You're terrible. She did a fantastic."
I don't know when it comes to doing readings, like I don't know what it is. Like I can preach fine, but if someone asks me to do a long reading, just my anxiety goes through the roof because I like skip lines, or I'll like read the same line twice, or like
right. And then of course I ask her to read out of Job. So your initial thought on that is like.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just imagine if you had to read all that, what Diane had to read that one Sunday.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I do want to issue one correction. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Towards the end of my message, I was giving 4 takeaways of what we can see and take away out of these plagues, these strikes, and one of them was that Yahweh is a just judge, and I talked about how I became aware of time all of a sudden. It's like, and I'm never one of those that feel like, okay, it's going to go into the negative red count here and show you how far you've gone over. God's word is God's word, and it deserves its time. But at the same time, we honor other people's times as well. So I was becoming aware. So I was trying to, land the plane, so to speak, a little bit. And I said that God was a just judge, and we see that whenever God instructs Moses to pick up the sand, throw it into the air, and that's where the gnats or the lice come from. And actually, that was not correct. It was actually God instructed Moses to strike the sand with his staff, and the sand became the gnats, the lice, whatever the winged creature there was. He did instruct Moses to pick something up and throw it into the air. He instructed him to go to the kiln, pick up the ash, throw it into the air, and then that became the boils that landed on the livestock and the human. So just a little bit of a correction I wanted to issue there that in principle I had it right, but wrong plague. Right. I guess that's what happens when you cover 8 in 35 minutes.
Yeah. Well, should we go through them real quick? Just sort of one by one, and then talk about little things that maybe we didn't get to cover.
Sure.
So first one, frogs.
Yeah. Well, that's the second plague, but I know that's the ones we covered. Yeah.
First of the second through eighth.
Right.
That we So frogs. What areas in that one do you think, was there much yet to?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about Heket in that, and let's take this approach at it. Let's break them down into their triads.
Okay.
Because the 10th plague, which is what we're getting ready to cover this Sunday, the Passover, that stands on its own.
Right.
I mean, that's unlike anything else that we're seeing here. So, out of the 9, you can break these up into triads, groups of 3. And some of the things that we can see, they're kind of attached horizontally, they're attached vertically. There's so many different layers of attachments that we just couldn't go into. And the first triad is plagues 1, 2, and 3. That's the Nile, the waters becoming blood. That's the frogs, and that's the gnats.
Yeah.
So as you break these down, one of the things that we see in the triads is that each first has something in common, like plague 1, plague 4, plague 7. They all have something in common, and that's that they happened in the morning, usually by the Nile River.
Yeah.
So you've got the Nile turning to blood. Then you've got, what is it, the flies is the 4th, and then the hailstorm is the 7th. All of these happened in the morning, and they were pronounced by the Nile River. So that's one of the things that attaches that the 1, 4, and 7. The second strike out of each of the triads, which would be the frogs, the livestock, and the locusts, all of these are proclaimed at Pharaoh's residence. Like Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. So the first one of each of the triads took place at the Nile in the morning. Like they had a community meeting there. These were all being announced at Pharaoh's residence, where in the company of Pharaoh. And then the third set, 3, 6, and 9, there's no announcements.
They just
happen.
And the Lord said to Moses, just do this.
Yeah. There's no announcement to Pharaoh.
So what's the significance of that? Like, because you said one's like they had like a group meeting, and then the other one, Moses and Aaron with themselves, and then God said, just do it.
Yeah, well, I think that there's just so many things that are playing into the background of all of this. I mean, I think that if you look at the significance of what's happening by the Nile River, I think the Nile turning to blood also had this backdrop of what Pharaoh did to the firstborn. Like whenever he was worried, at the very beginning we talked about this, that he was worried about the number of Israelites. So he ordered basically the firstborn sons to be killed. And really the punishment of that, the way that they did that, was in the Nile. So there was a significance of the Nile representing death, blood, and this would have been a background, in my mind, this would have been a background reminder to Pharaoh of, hey, you ordered this out of your power and your sovereignty and your authority. God's just reminding you here, even in the background, that this is that way. I think that whenever we look at the second one, where it takes place in front of Pharaoh in his residence or his hall or whatever, I think that backdrop and the background of that can go back to the first time that Moses and Aaron met with Pharaoh whenever they came from Midian. It happened in Pharaoh's courts, and that was the staff and the leprosy and do all of these signs type
It's almost
thing.
like a reminder, like God, like he's just trying to, almost like when they go to Pharaoh all the rest of the times, it's almost like, remember, we warned you.
Yeah.
And this is your fault.
Yeah.
Well, I find the one about the frogs fascinating out of all of them, in that, Moses says to Pharaoh, like, let my people go. And then there's kind of like that sort of back and forth. The frogs come up, and then I think it's in that one where Pharaoh says, yeah, if you go and get your God to stop doing this, I'll let your people go.
Yeah.
And actually says, I'll release them. And then Moses is like, when should I do it? And he says, tomorrow, which is kind of weird. Rather than go do it now, it's like...
As a frog sits on his head, he's like, just wait till tomorrow.
Yeah. And there's probably something in that, or probably some sermon series about procrastination.
we
And then Moses does it.
become friends with things. Yeah.
And then Moses does it. God releases or removes the frogs, or they'll die. So there's just frog carcasses
That'd be
everywhere.
fun, right in your house, shoveling
And-
those out.
Yeah, and then Pharaoh just changes his mind, doesn't let them
Yeah.
go. You know, so it's like the second one. There was already a promise of, if you stop it, I'll let them go,
Mhm.
and then
I
he
think
doesn't.
it almost seems like Pharaoh's just thinking like, oh yeah, it'll pass, like whatever,
Mhm.
it's not a big deal,
Yeah.
and then progressively it just gets worse and worse
Yeah.
until he just can't take it anymore.
Well, and the frogs were also another one that his magicians could replicate. You know,
Right.
we mentioned that yesterday
Yeah.
that, you know, it was the last one that they could replicate. And, you know, I kind of made the statement of, you know, what should you do whenever you've got frogs everywhere? Let's just create some more
Yeah.
frogs, you know?
The other thing is like, frogs are really noisy.
Oh, yeah.
Could you imagine the noise? The
No.
noise.
I mean, just,
around
you know,
Egypt.
and we had brought up, because we had
Yeah.
this conversation in private before, but I brought up that really plagues may not be the most accurate word for
Right.
this, that strikes, you know, God's signs, whatever it may be, that there's really one that kind of classifies as a classic definition of a plague. But then I also made the statement of like, and I recognize that none of us were going
Right.
through these. These
Yeah.
all probably felt very plague-like
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
they were having to endure this misery.
I know the one, because what happens to the gnats and the flies? Well, because the plague of the locusts,
Is that 8?
yeah, I
Yes.
think it's 8. Yeah,
Yep.
that one, I know exactly not how it feels, because obviously when the locusts, they come out every so often, and they're the most annoying. I mean, you mentioned like their noise is like this high pitch, whatever it is, it's just annoying. But one year it got really, really bad in Mount Sterling, and one got in my shirt, and I swear that thing was like this big,
Yeah.
and it was just in my shirt with these giant eyes, and it was the most freaky thing. So I can only imagine like them swarming everywhere.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
oh my
It's
gosh.
just miserable, man.
Well, I mean, cicadas are bizarre.
They're
They're just giant.
Yeah.
Like they're huge. They're so noisy. But yeah, and you pointed out. I mean, we're kind of going back and forth all over the place, but those last 3 are interesting in that they say like nobody had ever seen anything like this.
Yeah.
and we'll never see anything like
Yeah,
it again.
yeah,
You know,
that's
like the hail.
that's another thing that separates those into triad is like it's
Yeah.
the most, you know, it's the worst hailstorm that anyone has ever experienced. It's
Yeah.
the most locust that we've ever seen,
Yeah.
and then the darkness is the
Darker,
darkest,
yeah.
darkest darkness that we could see.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
it's weird.
Any other little areas in the middle ones before we sort of maybe focus on?
Not necessarily. A couple things before I forget them, though, because I kind of want to get into the decreation, how that works, because I've had some questions on that. But, you know, the, goodness, what is it? The third one, the gnats. That's the last one that the Israelites experienced. You know, going into the fourth one, which was flies, the Israelites, I don't know if, and I can't remember exactly, but I don't know if God removed them into the land of Goshen or if he just protected the land of Goshen. But at the end result was he basically built a wall, a hedge of protection around them, that after the blood, after the frogs, after the gnats, the Israelites didn't experience any more of the strikes, any more of these plagues. It was all just the Egyptians.
I know, like
at that point.
when the darkness comes, like literally, I think if I'm right, it says like it was just light only in Goshen. That's it. Everywhere else was just
Yep.
pitch black. So it was bizarre, but
Yeah, basically, you know, kind of the language was that the Egyptians could not see, but the Israelites could see. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there was like a supernatural vision almost that was given that it may have even been dark, but the Israelites could still see.
Doesn't
Or
it-
if it was just like this one beaming ray of, you know,
Right.
so.
Right.
it sounds like, wasn't that like? See, that's what in the event that's what happened, but it sounds almost like a spiritual blindness too,
Yeah.
because
Well,
like
that was one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, is that like it clearly doesn't use the word blindness,
Mm-hmm.
but uses the word darkness.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that is because of what you were saying about the what's the word, polemic or whatever, the
Polemic.
Yeah.
of if it was blindness, that doesn't have the same implication against Pharaoh
Right.
as
Yep.
darkness
Yeah,
would.
exactly.
And I like it made me think of the second apartment that Kylie and I lived in Lexington. our bedroom didn't have any windows just because of where we were. And when you closed the door at night, it was just pitch black. I mean, like, just
Excuse me.
so, like, it was just crazy dark. And I always thought it was hilarious because we would walk in and I would hear Opie running around on kind of the hardwood floor, and he would run in and we'd close the door and he would just freeze. And he'd be like, I don't know where anything is. But it was just one of those things where you just feel how dark it was.
Yeah.
One thing, there's a small podcast series by this little startup called Bible Project.
Yeah, just small. They'll make it someday.
They're catching up on us
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
But one of the things they pointed out about the gnats, I like that one.
It's the things James finds
Yeah,
funny.
yeah, yeah.
You know, it's just
The thing that they pointed out about the gnats was interesting. Of like, from the dust came life, but then
quick
in-
ahead of me, man.
I'm sorry. So, well, in Genesis, from the dust came life, but in here, the dust gets kicked up and brings death. Do you know
How
what I
am
mean?
I supposed to look incredibly intelligent when I have learned all of this stuff through other sources myself?
Thomas just figures out and
Thomas,
Well, we'll link their episode down below as well because it is.
go seriously
very
though.
good.
I mean, go to the Bible Project. They've got.
They
so
only-
much of our study.
Yeah.
And again, we pull from a lot of different sources.
Yeah.
We're not in the archives deep in the
Right.
dungeons of FCC uncovering all of this
Yeah.
information for the first time.
Yeah, but they cover this decreation perspective
yeah.
a lot in their episode, and they don't talk about the polemic
Right.
view.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's
one-
talk about the decreation, since you've already broken the ice and spoiler alerted that. So no, I mean, that was with each one of these, you can see a decreation. We can look at the polemic, which we're not endorsing that that's the primary one. That's just, I think, from a practical standpoint, as it affects people's lives, that's a really practical one that we can look at. So we've talked about some of the Egyptian god and goddesses, from Happy to Heket to Eris to Ra, and so many more in between.
Which there's a page on the website.
There
right?
is.
Has
There
everything
is.
about that.
Yeah. I encourage you to go check that out. But let's look at these decreation points. As Thomas was talking about, the one from, the gnats, turning from dust. That's an indication of life. So all of these can be tied back, and we're not even going to be able to go into depth on these in this. So maybe there's a chop for time or something. But it goes back to out of the dust we were formed. And so that gives this decreation thing of, hey, out of the dust I can create something that's also going to disrupt life as you know it. And like the Nile with the blood turning, I thought that one that I would have never put together that I did, that came from the Bible Project, was they was talking about how that with that being done with his staff, that there would have been a connotation of the power over the serpent.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Just with the way that all of that played out, that there was this imagery of this decreation of taking back all the way to whenever in Genesis was talking about that, that there will be power over this serpent, and it that would have been directly tied back to Pharaoh,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is just unbelievable.
Yeah. It kind of points to Moses as this Messiah type.
Right, yeah,
character.
this prototype, this imagery of
Yeah.
Jesus that we've talked about a couple times
Yeah.
coming ahead. But this is, instead of from a spiritual angle right now, this is being shown from a physical.
how because I know we talked about this the other night, like spiritual warfare. Like, you don't really see it as much in the Old Testament. Well, it's there, but not as much you do in the news. Like, I always wondered, how involved you see, Moses is a prototype, because in Genesis it says the woman's seed will basically crush
his head.
crush his
bruise
head.
her,
So I wonder how involved was Satan in this, and because this is Satan basically being a prototype of Jesus and crushing the serpent here, or having power or authority over the serpent. So I always
you mean
wondered.
Moses, just to clarify.
Yeah, Moses.
Okay,
Yeah.
I knew what you meant. I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure. Yeah.
So I always wondered how involved Satan was in this, but I feel like he's more behind the scenes because we don't actually see him in this. I don't know. I just always wondered about that because he's not as visibly present
Well, I mean, there would be a couple of perspectives on the Egyptian gods, right? There's one perspective which would say that they don't exist, and all of these people are just chasing nothingness. Another perspective would be to say that they're fallen angels alongside Satan who have convinced people that they are so-called gods and that they deserve to be followed, as in doing anything that they can not to follow Yahweh. And either way, it doesn't really matter, because either way, they're not. I think the wording you used was like a sovereign creator God on Sunday. It's like they're this like small g. Maybe there is a spiritual force behind each one.
Right.
You know, with the likes of the dark magic that's being done by the magicians.
I think there has to be some
something.
credence given to that. Yeah.
Either it was just trickery and they had frogs up their sleeves and they just sort of like threw them over something. I don't know. But
Like, oh no, what's wrong?
Just sort of sprinkled Kool-Aid in some water to make it look like blood. I've completely lost my place as far as going with that. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, there could be spiritual forces behind the scenes manipulating things, because it does talk about there are demons with power and dominion. Yeah. You know, we see that you were bringing up last night about Daniel, like the Prince of Persia, who was like held up, like there was this giant battle going on. And the angel was late because he had to get Archangel Michael to come give him a hand.
And Daniel, totally unaware of it, just kind of his offense growing day by day. He's like,
like
it's about time, you know.
It's like, I've been praying forever. He's like, do you have no idea
Like,
what's
seriously,
going
I get it. I'm kind of the Gandalf whenever Frodo wakes up in Rivendell. It's like, where were you, Gandalf? He's like, I was delayed. You know?
Yeah. But it does lay an interesting perspective on all of these sort of Old Testament stories where there's other gods involved, where it's like it could be a very real spiritual force tricking people into thinking that they are the creator god, like with Baal or what's the other one? Something. I keep wanting to say Akatosh,
Asherah.
But that's from
Asherah.
Asherah.
That's from Skyrim. Asherah. You know, all these other ones that are convincing people to follow them, or nowadays, atheism,
Right.
Money, power, sex, like all those control, all the ones that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe it just looks a bit different, but we like say that it's nothing.
Yeah.
But
the speaking of frogs being thrown out of people's sleeves, you know, I think that one of the tie-ins that they made from a decreation standpoint with the frogs was, you know, the frogs are amphibians. Yeah, because it says that that is decreating when God separated the land from the sea. That frogs are
they break the
amphibious.
category.
Right, they break the category because you have sea creatures, which if you want to dig into that, go ahead. The sea creature reference in Genesis that's also kind of made in Exodus as well. But it says that frogs can live both on land and in water. So God is just kind of showing that, listen, I separated them. I can bring them back together, which I thought was was pretty interesting.
It's a really interesting way of looking at that.
So, and then, you know, we covered the gnats with the dust, and then flies were
bigger gnats.
Yeah, exactly. But that would have represented death. You know, how God created life. You know, what are flies attracted to? Things that are decomposing, things that are dead. Which
is interesting because that has come before the livestock have died.
Yep.
I mean, maybe they're just there for the
there's
frog
a lot of
carcasses.
probably. I was going to say there's probably a lot of dead frogs still, man. You know? And then you got the livestock, which would have been, you know, a decreation of God. You know,
creating the animals,
right? And then boils. This is an interesting one. I don't know if you remember this or not, but the Hebrew word for boil is actually the same word for snake or serpent, only spelled backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that wasn't uncommon. If you dig into the way that the Hebrew language was used, was written, that wasn't uncommon. So there's this meaning here that there's this you know, these boils that are coming upon them, coming from the ash, would have been very symbolic as well.
Yeah.
You know, hail, and both hail and locusts would have gone against the creation of vegetation, animals, things that were basically life-sustaining. God's saying that I not only gave you life, but I also created things that sustains your life, and I can uncreate or decreate that
Kind
as
of
well.
going through each of the 6 days of creation.
He is.
you know, you've
It's
got
mirroring.
Is it-
the two triads of creation are being mirrored in the three triads.
Is it following it in order almost? Like for each day of
No,
creation,
Not
each one of these?
necessarily. Yeah.
No, because the last one that we focus on here is darkness, which goes back to day 1.
Yep.
Because
Because he separated the light
And
from the dark,
yeah.
or order and chaos. Think about that. I really hadn't, up until this morning, I really hadn't considered the amount. I mean, we talked about the weight of darkness, that you could actually feel it, but the chaos that was bound to be ensuing at this point. Like light brings order. Just like you were talking about Odie, just freezing, just like,
Yeah.
okay. I never really considered the amount of chaos that could set in 72 hours of darkness.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So,
true.
but that's kind of a very zoomed out look at the decreation view, because like I said, I have had a few people ask me, because we've covered the polemic a little bit, but they were really interested in the decreation
Right.
viewpoint of
Yeah.
it. And so there is a mirroring between Genesis, the creation story, the 6 days that we see here.
Yeah. I think the chaos one, the darkness one, is particularly interesting, just especially with the polemic view of nighttime representing death, but then every morning Ra overcomes chaos and
Yes.
darkness,
Yep.
Yeah.
and it's this victorious sunrise.
Yeah, it's like a
And then-
celebration.
Yeah,
type
and then all of a
thing.
sudden, hey, Ra didn't win.
Right. Right.
Where's
yeah.
Ra?
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, but which is, first of all, an awful way to live.
Right.
Thinking every night when I go to bed, it's like, hopefully Ra wins tomorrow. I mean, I don't know how committed they were to that belief, but I mean,
Right.
it's, and I wonder what Pharaoh, in nowadays, there would be a public statement made to talk about, it's like, if a political system is failing, they would have to put out a
Right.
statement on, or Pharaoh had to talk to his people about why him and his father god
Yeah,
being Ra.
what type of like political spin?
Yeah.
That would be an interesting thing as to how that the leaders of Egypt, if at all, are spinning this
To the
these
people.
events. Again, that's why we need streaming services in heaven, so we can kind of see these types of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I always wonder. Yeah, that's something interesting. Like, I wonder if like the Egyptian people, or one, I always wonder how much the Egyptian people actually saw Pharaoh. Like how we
True.
like we see the president on TV, but we don't see him hardly.
Right.
Right.
Plus, we live in Kentucky, so
I've heard he hasn't come to Grayson.
yeah, I don't. He probably doesn't know where Grayson is.
He's not heard of Trace.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Missing out.
Let's
Missing
throw a
out.
little chicken deluxe towards Washington, and they'll be coming. They'll be coming.
Because I always wondered, like, one, how much they actually saw the pharaohs,
Yeah.
or like, because I know like in Rome, like I'd say the Romans probably saw Caesar more than they saw the Egyptians saw the pharaoh, but like, and then like when he did make a pronouncement, like of how like, I don't know how rare that would have been, and then like how he would have had to spin that, but then also like, how stupid do you think his people is to say like, oh well, Ra lost last night, but he won today, and it just keeps going over and over and over again, and then it's like, I don't know, like it just doesn't make any
Yeah,
sense.
but the question has to be asked though: is that can that really be classified as stupidity when that's foundational belief systems that
Yeah, for them,
that's been part of your culture and your life far beyond what most of them have existed.
but I think,
I mean, that was life.
but I think like another question I always had was like, how did the people view Pharaoh, knowing that he is supposed to be Ra's son, but yet like the darkness happens every night, so isn't he supposed to have power over that? So like, how weak would have made him look? That darkness happened every night.
But that was considered the cycle of life at that point. Like that was just this is what happens. This is one of the reasons that Ra exists, is because if he didn't exist, then no one would be powerful over the darkness.
Hmm.
So we have him, and that's like, Ra needs a break too. So I mean, it's a resetting, basically. From an astrology standpoint, in particular with ancient Egypt, that would have been a resetting of life, basically.
And then shows how powerful Yahweh is, and he'll need
exactly.
breaks.
That's the primary takeaway from all of these, is that Yahweh is the only true God.
One thing I find interesting about that is like one of the differences between the Genesis creation narrative and all of the other sort of creation narratives that we get from Exodus or from Egypt and Babylon and all that kind of stuff, is that there was no battle against darkness.
Yeah.
So like every morning Ra overcomes darkness, whereas with Yahweh he just gives it its place. He just tells it what to do, which is like puts a whole other perspective on Yahweh of like even the darkness, which usually represents chaos, submits to him as it's not this sort of big struggle battle that he has to overcome. It's just he just says, hey, you go here.
Well, I think
You go here.
I think the greatest illustration of that I've heard is that with modern our modern conveniences, we have electricity, and in our homes, if it's dark, we walk into a room, we flip a switch, and what happens? Like if everything's functioning and connected properly, the light just comes on.
Right.
There's no resistance. There's no interruption somewhere along the way, kind of like the Daniel with the prayer thing. It doesn't get halfway up the wall, and then there's like this demonic resistance that the darkness that hits it is just like, okay, I'm going to subdue this. It's just like you flip the switch, the light comes on, and that's kind of the same thing with that was the illustration of God, is he just spoke it, and there was no resistance.
Yeah.
It's just like there.
Yeah. Any other?
I've talked a lot. Anything from you all that from the plague standpoint, and kind of a observation of digging deeper that we may have missed.
Well, you go ahead, Thomas.
Nope.
I was wondering, like, how many of these plagues happened, like, I don't know, because I think, like, the way we think, like, in my head at least, I always wonder, like, how many of these plagues happened at once, or did God separate them out in, like, a plague happened one day, then the next day a plague happened, or did some of these happen together?
Yeah.
I always wondered that, and then like how I don't know, like how brutal that would have got, because some of them I always wonder, like, did they happen together? Some of them at least.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Yeah, we're only given timeline indications on the
couple
first
of them,
one. Yeah, maybe
7 days.
just 7 days from the Nile turning to blood.
You have the 72 hours of darkness,
Yeah.
and then the frogs. It's like 2 days.
Yeah.
Right, because it's dealt with the next day.
Right. And then I think that we also have to keep in mind as we're reading things like this that especially Hebrew, the Hebrew narrative was written in a way and in a style for it to be memorized. So there's a certain kind of rhythm and a cadence within the writing, especially during this time. That way, because written records weren't really a thing at that point. It was more of that way when you're meditating on them, that you could bring them back to memory easier, you could memorize them better. So there's a narrative flow that we have to understand that Old Testament scripture in particular is written with. And we'll see that coming up with the 10th plague, is there's some elements in here of you can see it, and sometimes I think I get myself in this mindset that when I'm reading things like the 10 plagues, is like we're reading them in real time. And it's not necessarily, we're not reading an account that's written in real time. We're reading an account that was written after the fact. And we have to weigh the consideration in there that it was written in a narrative form so that it would be easily understood, easily memorized, easily recalled. And there's a rhythm and there's a cadence to it, and we'll see that playing out especially next week in the 10th plague,
which doesn't make them untrue.
Correct. Correct.
Like something can be written in a sort of poetic or structured manner, like literature is, to make a point. Like the way that this is laid out does make a point back to Genesis. Doesn't mean that what happened didn't happen. Which we talked about. We were talking about hell, which was a really fun conversation.
Yeah. As we do.
Yeah.
You know.
Last week, and I was talking about like the two pictures that we have for hell is fire and darkness,
Mm-hmm.
which have to be metaphorical, like because you can't have both
Yeah.
simultaneously. But that doesn't mean that it's not real.
Yeah.
It just means that it's bad.
Yeah.
you know. So same with this. I mean, I'm not saying that this is metaphorical, but
Well, I mean, we have to be okay with the fact that when you're writing with the reader in mind,
Mm-hmm.
you're conveying truth and actual fact, but it's written with the reader or the consumer in mind. It's no different than a lesson that we teach. This podcast, this YouTube video that we're doing right now, the sermons that we do on Sunday morning, it's conveying truth, but we frame it and we present it in a way with the listener or the reader in mind.
Yeah.
And that's the exact, from a biblical literature standpoint, it's the same thing.
yeah,
Yeah, unless you're Paul and you just go all out,
tangents.
Well, I mean, then you're just writing letters.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
which is a little bit
I
different.
I didn't mean to
Yeah.
sound dismissive just writing letters. I mean, you're writing letters at that point.
Yeah. So next week we're doing the last plague then, going
Yes.
into darkness.
Yes.
Or sorry,
Yeah. No, we're coming out.
coming
of
out.
darkness.
Coming,
That'll happen. here a
chapter
little bit later.
11.
11 through 13. I mean, it's not all of 13, but the details of the Passover and the narrative of the Passover kind of carry through. And it's going to be an interesting look. I've enjoyed the research that I've done up until this point, and the study from here on out is going to be even better. Just again, approaching the Passover from the standpoint of how do we approach it from more than just a historical event, and provide information. How does the Passover continue to be applicable, relevant, practical to us today?
Yeah. Very cool. Sounds exciting.
Yeah.
We're definitely picking up some pace.
Yeah, we are. So make sure you read 11 through 13
Yeah.
this week.
Yeah.
Because again, just like we did 8 through 10, I'm not going to be able to read it all.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, if you want to know more about the polemic view, go to the page on the website. It'll be linked down below. And if you're interested in a much more in-depth decreation thing, that Bible Project podcast,
It's fantastic.
it's a lot longer. It's like an hour and 20 minutes or something.
They're a lot smarter than we are.
Yeah. So they get into that. We'll link that down below as well.
They compete with us.
And is there
Poor them.
is there anything else I'm thinking of or I've forgotten?
Nope.
Cool. Well, slightly longer episode today. But yeah, we'll be back again next week. And we're going to be looking at the death of the firstborn, which is not a particularly happy talk.
Happy is he who throws the babies against the rocks,
Rocks.
right?
Yeah,
Look that up.
Yeah.
Biblically, look that up. That's
Yeah.
not just something I pulled off the top of my head.
Yeah. You've just opened a huge can of worms and rabbit holes that people are going to be going down. Cool. Well, we're going to be back here next week. Like and comment, subscribe, do all the things that help us out. And hopefully more people can hear what we're talking about, our nonsense.
That way we can stay ahead of the Bible Project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious. We'll see you next week. Bye.